today is film and TV producer and editor Michael P. Mason.
Hi, nice to see everybody.
Welcome, Michael. And yeah, so we're just going to get started with can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, how long you've been in the business?
I grew up in Canada. I'm actually originally from Vancouver and spent many years in Canada. And then about 11 years ago, I got my green card and came down to LA, and I've been here ever since. I've started working in the film industry when I was quite young. I'm actually a second generation film brat. So my stepfather was a set painter in the art department, and actually my first film set was First Blood, the original Rambo. So I got my start quite early, and sort of worked my way through the paint department, but found that it wasn't something that necessarily spoke to me as a artist, as a filmmaker, and so I sort of moved around into different departments and eventually settled on post-production, and I sort of found my home there. So
Fantastic. And can you share a little bit about what that experience was like, being on First Blood and being on your first set as a child? What do you remember?
I mean, for me, movies have always been something that I loved. It's always been one of my true loves, and so I think for me as a child to go on a film set and to be exposed to how they make movies versus what you see on the screen in front of you. I mean, everybody remembers kind of their first film or the first big film that they saw, where you're surrounded by this, huge, larger than life, these images and music, and but there's a disconnect, and what's happening up there, how could I possibly do that? And so to be brought behind the scenes at such an early age, and have a stepfather who worked in that industry, was a real, chance for me to kind of understand that it's something tangible that I actually could do as a living. And he was part of the paint department, and so the scenes that he was involved in Rambo, there was a whole cave scene sequence in it where John Rambo, the Sylvester Stallone character, sort of escapes into a cave, and they barricade him in there. And so the exterior was all shot live, and it was actually out of town, north of Vancouver, in a town called Hope, and it was an actual cave. But the caves themselves, inside the caves, were built in a soundstage, and they're made out of foam and then painted to look like real caves. And so that was the set I got to visit. So it was interesting for me as a kid to see really behind the sort of, the curtain, and to get to see the magic that the wizard's doing, and the, and all the sort of tricks that they use to make things look real on camera, but then they're not necessarily real. So
The movie magic.
exactly, yeah. So I got exposed to that at a very young age, and so I think it helped in terms of, creating that imagination in my head of like, oh, I could actually do this, and then it was just sort of a matter of finding what spoke to me in terms of, the part of the storytelling that I wanted to be a part of. So.
And obviously that was wonderful exposure, sort of seeing that, behind the scenes, the movie magic. But in terms of the inspirations, in terms of the directors that you remember, or the films, who really spoke to you as a child? What were your inspirations?
I think for me, I mean, I guess I'm dating myself here, but I can't sort of I can't really emphasize enough how important it was for me, that moment, which a lot of kids probably had in the first Star Wars film, when I first saw it in a theater, and it was in the theaters for years, or for a year and a half or something originally. And I remember sitting in the theater in that first moment when ship sort of flies over you, and you see all these lasers, and then suddenly the destroyer comes over behind it, the Star Destroyer comes behind it, and it just goes on forever, and it's so immense. And it was a moment for me that I still think back, and I didn't, I can't say I was 7 or something, so I can't really say, oh, well, I saw that and I knew I wanted to be this, or I wanted to be a director, or I wanted to be an actor. I didn't really understand all that, but what I did understand is there was something happening on the screen in front of me that made me feel a way, and that I somehow wanted to be a part of that world, that I wanted to and I think from then on, it was always sort of, adventure movies. It was things like that sort of inspire that imagination as a kid. The Indiana Joneses, the I remember as a kid loving Man Who Would Be King, which was sort of an adventure story that took place in a fictional area, sort of in the Middle East slash Siberia, sort of in the stands. It was a fictitious thing that Rudyard Kipling had written about, and so I think those kind of action adventure things definitely spoke to me as a kid. But then as I got older, I really found myself falling in love with horror films, and so even as a young kid, I would go and talk my parents into taking me to horror films, even though they would scare me and keep me up and give me nightmares, but then I would always want to go back and see another one. And so I sort of always gravitated towards those, I guess, adrenaline junkie movies. I don't know.
Absolutely, absolutely. So then now walk us through, so you start off in the paint department. What was that progression like? How did you find your path into, obviously producing and editing?
I think initially it was, the paint department, and I worked for a while in sort of that art department behind the scenes, but I never felt like I was part of the telling of the story. I mean, you're very hyper focused on, on backgrounds, on the sets, on creating, the sort of backgrounds that people are acting in front of, but you're not necessarily putting the story together. And there's a sort of a disconnect, or at least there was for me, from the actual process of making a film and the process of the art department. And so when I got the opportunity, I moved into to lighting and camera, which was more, at least it felt to me to be more present in terms of being a part of the making of the films. You're there, you're lighting scenes, you're working with actors, you're shooting stuff. And then I actually had a job on a TV show that I got just as a sort of a segment writer, director, producer, shooting stuff, and then working with the post department to put those together to as individual segments to fit into the television show. And I got more interested in post-production, and then when an opportunity sort of presented itself, I kind of fell into the post department. And I think I always had the intentions of moving towards being a director, and so all of the things that I did were always educating myself in what other jobs there were, so that I understood what it took to make a film. And as I fell into post, I think one of the things, it felt to me like I was a part of that putting together of the story. And you spend hours, working by yourself and working with a director or working with a producer to sort of painstakingly put this film together or tell the story. And that sort of felt to me like the closest thing to being a director, to being, but not necessarily being sort of on a project as long as a director does. I mean, there's a lot of energy and I think both emotional and creative energy that directors have to insert into a project, from years before they shoot and then years afterwards. And so you're on a project for a long time. And I think if you're not passionate about the story, it becomes hard to sort of sustain that. Yeah. Whereas as an editor, I get to come along and sort of help somebody tell their story. So
would you say would you say that you learned sort of through experience, mostly sort of being thrown into those roles and on-the-job training, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I did go to film school. I have a background as a musician, so I played music for years, and I went to music school. But at a certain point, when I shifted my interest and decided that I wanted to go into film, I actually went in and did a minor in film. I didn't do the production program because it would have meant going back to school for another 4 years, and so I actually went back and did a minor, which was sort of analysis. It was scene breakdown. It was understanding history. It was understanding how people put together scenes by looking at great films, and understanding what the directors were doing and what drove them to put a scene together the way it did. And those kind of ideas, created all sorts of things in my head of like, oh, I want to try this, I want to try that. And because I had a background in music, I sort of fell into music videos, and I started directing music videos for a while. And I did that for a bit, and then again, I ended up getting a job in a TV show and fell into post-production. And so I think once I had completed a few years in the industry, being in Canada, Norman Joseph is a very famous Canadian director and producer. You know, he did things like Moonstruck and The Hurricane. He came down to Hollywood and became a big success. Was getting near the end of his career. He's now passed away, but he, you know, when he was in his 80s, he decided to move home to Canada. And one of the things he thought we needed as Canadians was a center higher learning, kind of like the American Film Institute, the AFI, and he decided he was going to create one in Canada. So he created this thing called the Canadian Film Center. And so I went there as part of their program, which is sort of for mid-level career, like people who are in the middle of their career, to go back and sort of like doing a master's degree. And I was in their program called the Editor's Lab, which works concurrently with a producer's lab, a writer's lab, and a director's lab. And then after you do this intensive program, afterwards there's a short film that you produce or work together with other people from your program to produce, that's shot on 35mm film. And so I actually ended up film as well as editing it, working with a director who I became very good friends with and have worked with many times. And so we went and shot that film, and it premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival. And so that was sort of my introduction into kind of the multi-hyphenate of producer-editor.
Right, right. And how would you say, speaking of multi-hyphenate, how would you say that producing informs your editing and editing informs your producing?
I think they're actually very symbiotic in terms of, you know, some of the hyphenates maybe don't work as well, and I think one of the things about editing is, I mean, you have to be focused on telling the story, and I see myself as sort of the you know, the person who's there to protect the entire story, as opposed to just one scene or one performance or one, you know, one line or one, you know, one joke or, you know, one camera move, whatever it is. You're there to really protect the entire, you know, you have to sort of see it from above and be able to see the story and how everything fits together, and you're there to protect the whole story. As a producer, that's sort of, you know, you're in a similar position. I mean, you're not focused on necessarily, you know, one scene or one location or one anything. You're to try and make sure that the entity as a whole is something that's going to be successful. And so I think they're very symbiotic that way. I think obviously as an editor, in terms of workflow on a feature film, it's different on a short because you're shooting less days. But on a feature film, in order to be there to support the director and the producers and to make sure that they're getting what they need, you should be assembling ideally a production. So they're shooting on Monday, the footage gets shipped off to post house, whoever's doing your dailies, and they turn it into files that the editor can work with, and on Tuesday you're editing what they shot on Monday, and hopefully by the end of you finished what they shot on Monday, and the director can look at it and say, oh, I missed this shot, or I don't like this performance, I want to maybe do a pickup, and or it doesn't quite fit with, you know, the way I thought this character's going to be progressing, or whatever the case may be. Then they have opportunity to go and do pickups. And so ideally you're assembling a day behind. Obviously as a producer, there's a million problems flying at you while you're in production and you're trying to put out fires constantly. So if you're editing a film that you're also producing, it can be problematic unless you have a producer there who can sort of be on set and be the producer on the ground to take care of things while you're shooting, because you're at that point having to focus on assembling and putting the story together.
Yeah.
So it definitely, while the mentality is kind of symbiotic, I think you have to have partners that you're comfortable with in terms of people that you work with. So
yeah. And what's your philosophy when sort of putting together your production team as a producer? Is there, you know,
I mean,
is it people you've worked with in the past? Is it is it people whose work you admire? Is it do you usually step into that team? How does that usually come about?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of all of the above. I think certainly if you've worked with someone before and you find that you have similar sensibilities or similar work ethic or just understanding of you know, what somebody's job is, and they have the similar understanding, I think those are things that, you start to get a shorthand and you work with that person. I have a number of directors that I've worked with a lot as an editor, and so you develop a shorthand, and there's a level of trust between you, and that certainly is helpful. But I also think sometimes, infusing it with sort of new blood or new energy can be great. I think a lot of times it's word of mouth referral. That goes for me even just getting jobs too. Sometimes I'll get a call from someone who says, I got your name from, and they're looking for an editor, or they're looking for somebody to help them produce, and they got my name through somebody else who's worked with me. So I think a lot of it is, it's definitely, it's people you've worked with, it's referrals, but I think long-standing relationships, it's somebody like Clint Eastwood, for instance, and he's worked with the same people year after year after year, and there's a reason why his movies always come in under time, under budget, because he doesn't need to waste time trying to explain things to someone. He says one word and the DP gets what he's going for, so.
Yeah, and so you've been in the business for a bit of time. You've been exposed to it as a child, and family members that worked in it. Kind of a loaded question, but how would you feel? How do you feel like the film and TV industry has evolved since you started?
It's definitely changed, and I think right now we're seeing a complete shift in the landscape. I think in terms of how you're seeing film financed has changed. I think in terms of end delivery, like with the delivery, the method of exhibition has changed. When I grew up, I used to go to the movies. One of my favorite things to do. Even during my 20s, I would often go to matinees on the weekend by myself, and I'd sit there and, the thing of popcorn and watch a movie, and, even if I didn't have a friend to go to, I just would love to immerse myself in. And you're seeing more and more now, people are not going to theaters, and it's less access, it's rising costs, I think, and in terms of, a family for four to go to a movie, I don't even know what it would cost now, so it makes more sense. People also have essentially theater grade sort of home entertainment systems now, where they can go and sit, at home and watch, Netflix or Amazon or, whatever streaming service at home on a 65-inch television with surround sound. And so it makes that experience totally different. I think that unfortunately has shifted the way we have to finance films, and so you're seeing a lot more micro budget films, and big tentpole studio films that are $250 million, and the in between right now is harder and harder to get financed. But I think the fact that means of production is, you can shoot a film now on an iPhone. You can shoot, you look at somebody like Sean Baker, who did Anora, that won, swept the Academy Awards. That movie was made for very little money, and it was made with, a small crew. And so I think more and more you're seeing filmmakers who have that means of production is being put in their hands, and they're able to get access to a global audience. So there are definitely pluses and minuses, I think.
Absolutely. And so you have a very unique perspective because you're a producer, and so from the standpoint of budgeting, I imagine technology is helping to reduce some costs, but from the standpoint of editing, it's making your life a bit easier. Can you speak a little bit about how that is? How have you felt the impact in having both roles, and just where you see it going?
Well, I think certainly just in the editing room alone, the advent of sort of high-res digital photography as opposed to 35 mil. I didn't do a lot of, I'm not that old, I didn't do a lot of cutting on film, but I did, when I got my start, I did a little 1/16, and so I do know the process of cutting film, and it was very laborious, and if you wanted to try something new, an experiment, it was a very long, a long process to then go back to what you had. Now you can just duplicate a timeline and turn around and you're back where you started. So it does allow experimenting, and I think, shooting on, on 8K and being able to blow shots up allows you more flexibility, and I think so, and it just doesn't cost as much to shoot, in that way. So I think there are things that are very positive moving forward in terms of indie filmmaking, and I think the technology is making it easier and easier to do some of these things. So.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to be wrapping up in a second, but what is on the horizon for you? What are you excited about?
Well, I just finished an episode of season 6 of a show called Slasher. That's an AMC Plus Shudder series. It's a horror anthology, and so I finished an episode of that, which will be coming out later this year. And I have a documentary film, a short documentary that I co-directed with my wife, Leanne Melissa Bishop, who was on this earlier, and it's a documentary about an organization, an NGO out of Los Angeles that is doing anti-poaching. They're trying to combat wildlife crime, and also working with first responders globally to try and help train people. So we're really excited about that. That'll hopefully hit the film circuit soon. And then we have some other projects of our own, some feature films that are in various states of development that we hope to shoot one later this year. So
That sounds very exciting. I'm
Yeah.
sure our viewers would definitely keep an eye out for those. Social media wise, any place they can go to sort of stay on top of things?
yeah, I'm Mason_MP on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I have a website at michaelpmason.com, which has all of my sort of social media links on it, and clips from some of the stuff that I've edited, some of the stuff I've produced, and so you can find me there. And of course, I'm on the IMDb.
Awesome. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you
and
very much.
we're done. Thank you so much. And goodbye.
Thanks for listening.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully I didn't ramble too much.
No, you're great. You're